When most people imagine queens of the medieval world, they picture elegant women sitting on golden thrones, draped in silks, their crowns glittering under torchlight. History books and paintings present them as figures of grace, dignity, and religious devotion. But behind the closed doors of castles and palaces, the reality was far darker and far more shocking than anyone dared to say aloud. Queens were not just symbols of power. They were also trapped inside a brutal system that dictated what they could and could not do with their own bodies. Sexuality was not a private matter for them. It was a weapon of politics, a tool of manipulation, and at times, a prison that destroyed their dignity. From the moment a queen married into power, her body was no longer her own. Kings, advisors, priests, and even rival nobles watched her every move. A queen's most important duty was to provide an heir, and this expectation opened the door to practices that ranged from humiliating to disturbing. Every intimate detail of her life could become public property. Some queens were forced into bizarre rituals to prove their virginity on their wedding night, with bloody sheets paraded through the palace to silence rumors. Others were subjected to invasive inspections by priests and midwives, stripping away any sense of privacy. And then there were the darker rumors, the whispered stories of queens who sought pleasure outside of marriage, of secret lovers hidden in monasteries or even among palace guards. These tales, often written by enemies, mixed truth with scandal. But they reveal something chilling. Queens were both feared and desired, both sacred and shamed. Their sexual lives were not only judged by the church but also weaponized by their political rivals. The medieval obsession with control over queen sexuality shaped kingdoms and determined wars. A single accusation of infidelity could lead to executions, annulments, or bloody rebellions. And yet, queens themselves sometimes used their sexuality as a weapon too, turning bedroom secrets into powerful political tools. But what were these practices exactly? What humiliations, rituals, and shocking expectations were forced upon women who seemed untouchable in public but lived under constant surveillance in private? The answers will take us into some of the darkest corners of medieval royal life, where power and intimacy collided in ways that might disgust, disturb, and surprise you. In medieval Europe, a queen's wedding night was not always a private celebration between two people. It was often a public performance, carefully staged to prove a bride's purity to the entire kingdom. Virginity was treated as a political weapon, and queens were its most valuable pawns. If a queen failed to meet expectations, her reputation, her marriage, and even the stability of the throne could collapse overnight. One of the most humiliating practices was the so-called virginity test. Before or after marriage, queens could be examined by midwives or church officials to confirm their purity. Imagine the most powerful woman in the land stripped of her dignity, her body judged like property. This practice was degrading, but it was also dangerous, because false accusations of lost virginity could ruin a queen's life. Its rivals often spread rumors, claiming she had already known another man. Such whispers were enough to question her children's legitimacy, placing the entire royal bloodline under threat. Then came the wedding night spectacle. In many courts, it was not enough for a king and queen to simply consummate their marriage. Courtiers, priests, or attendants would sometimes gather outside the chamber door, listening for proof of intimacy. In some traditions, bloody sheets from the marital bed were paraded before nobles and servants, displayed like trophies of honor. To modern eyes, it seems grotesque, a deeply personal act transformed into public theater. But in medieval times, it was considered vital. These rituals were not just about sex. They were about control. By proving a queen's virginity and fertility, the kingdom reassured itself that heirs would be legitimate, alliances secure, and dynasties preserved. For queens, however, it meant living under constant scrutiny, where the most intimate aspects of their bodies were never private. And yet these virginity rituals were only the beginning. What awaited queens after marriage was often far worse. Some found themselves forced into unnatural expectations to satisfy the desires of kings. Others endured medical treatments designed to guarantee fertility, practices that today would be seen as cruel and invasive. The further we look into these rituals, the more disturbing truths begin to surface. Because what happened inside the royal bedchamber often shaped the fate of entire empires. Once the virginity rituals were over, queens faced an even harsher reality. They were expected to bear children as quickly as possible, and preferably sons. A queen who could not produce an heir was seen as useless, no matter how intelligent, loyal, or politically skilled she might be. Her entire worth in the eyes of the court was reduced to her fertility, and this pressure led to shocking and often cruel practices. Medieval medicine, still steeped in superstition, treated queens like experimental subjects. Physicians and priests recommended bizarre remedies to increase fertility. Queens were sometimes forced to drink potions made of herbs, animal parts, or even crushed insects, all believed to enhance conception. Others were made to undergo humiliating rituals, such as lying in certain positions after intercourse, or being smeared with strange mixtures across their bodies. Some of these so-called cures were harmless, but others were toxic, weakening the very women they were supposed to help. There are accounts of queens being bled by leeches or subjected to heated stones pressed against their abdomens to open the womb. If pregnancies failed, the blame almost always fell on the queen, regardless of whether the king himself was infertile. In some courts, if a queen failed to conceive, advisors even suggested that the king test his seed on other women to prove his virility. The humiliation for the queen was unbearable, as her failures became public matters of state. But the pressure to conceive wasn't only about medicine. Queens were often forced into relentless cycles of pregnancy, enduring back-to-back childbirths with little regard for their health. Many queens suffered from miscarriages, stillbirths, or dangerous complications, yet were expected to try again almost immediately. Their bodies became battlegrounds, used to secure dynasties at the cost of their own well-being. This relentless demand for fertility stripped queens of any control over their intimate lives. Even when they were gravely ill, they were pressured to share a bed with their husbands, because producing an heir was considered more important than their health or comfort. And yet, for all these sacrifices, queens were still accused of betrayal if they failed to give birth to sons. Whispers of affairs or witchcraft often followed, as desperate courts looked for someone to blame. But some queens, unwilling to accept these chains, began to fight back. Secret affairs, forbidden lovers, and shocking scandals would soon rewrite the rules of royal sexuality and plunge entire kingdoms into chaos. Not every queen accepted her role as a silent victim of the crown's demands. Some, trapped in loveless marriages and burdened by the endless cycle of fertility expectations, sought comfort elsewhere. And when they did, the results shook kingdoms to their core. Behind palace walls, passion often burned in the shadows. Some queens secretly pursued affairs with knights, courtiers, or even servants. These forbidden relationships weren't always about love. Sometimes they were about survival. In a world where kings could take mistresses without consequence, queens risked everything just to feel a sense of freedom or to escape their loneliness. One of the most infamous examples was Isabella of France, the wife of King Edward II of England. Trapped in a marriage to a king who openly favored his male companions over her, Isabella is believed to have taken a lover of her own, Roger Mortimer. Their affair turned into a political conspiracy that led to the downfall of Edward himself. What began as a secret passion became one of the greatest scandals of the medieval age. But affairs were not always so grand. Many queens lived in fear of discovery, that a single whisper of infidelity could destroy their reputations and lead to brutal punishment. Some accused queens were locked away in convents for life. Others faced public humiliation or even execution. The threat of being branded an adulteress was enough to keep most women silent, no matter how miserable their marriages were. Still, the double standard was undeniable. Kings flaunted their mistresses, fathered illegitimate children, and spread diseases throughout their courts, while queens lived under suffocating scrutiny. Even the suggestion of impropriety could ruin them. And yet, despite the dangers, stories of queens and their secret lovers continued to echo through history. Some were true. Others were fabricated by enemies seeking to discredit powerful women. Either way, these tales fed into the belief that queens were always one scandal away from betraying the throne. The irony, however, was that many queens didn't choose these affairs for passion alone. For some, it was about political power, aligning themselves with ambitious nobles or using secret relationships to influence the kingdom in ways their marriages never allowed. But the risks were enormous. Discovery could bring shame not just on the queen, but on the entire royal line. And in some cases, suspicions about illegitimate heirs brought kingdoms to the brink of civil war. The obsession with controlling queen sexuality only grew harsher after such scandals. But the cruelty wasn't limited to accusations of affairs. In some courts, queens were subjected to shocking public examinations, forced to prove their purity in front of witnesses. That grotesque ritual of humiliation is the next dark secret we must uncover. Few things reveal the cruelty of medieval courts more than the humiliating rituals queens endured to prove their purity. Virginity was not just a matter of honor, it was a political weapon, a public guarantee that any children born to the queen would truly belong to the king. But how could a court be sure? The answer was as shocking as it was degrading. Some queens were subjected to virginity examinations before marriage. In these disturbing ceremonies, physicians, midwives, or even court officials would physically inspect a young bride's body to confirm her intactness. The idea of such an intrusion, often done in front of witnesses, stripped queens of all dignity. It was less about science, which was primitive at best, and more about control and spectacle. The cruelty did not end there. In certain kingdoms, after the wedding night, sheets stained with blood were publicly displayed to prove the consummation of marriage. This practice turned the most private moment of a queen's life into a grotesque performance for the court. If no blood appeared, whispers of deception, witchcraft, or infidelity quickly followed, even though many women naturally did not bleed. The queen was humiliated regardless of truth. Imagine the terror for young brides, often teenagers, entering marriage under such conditions. Their bodies became objects of scrutiny, their most intimate moments transformed into public trials. Failure to meet these impossible standards could destroy their reputations forever. Some queens accused of failing these tests were branded as liars or even punished as if they had betrayed the crown. Others faced annulments, banishment, or lifelong imprisonment in convents. The system was designed not to protect women, but to safeguard dynasties at their expense. What made these rituals even more disturbing was the hypocrisy behind them. Kings were never required to prove their own chastity or fidelity. Their mistresses roamed the court freely, and their illegitimate children often received noble titles. Yet queens, expected to remain flawless and faithful, endured humiliations that stripped them of humanity. For many, these rituals were only the beginning of a lifetime of surveillance and suspicion. Queens could never escape the constant pressure to prove their worth, through purity, fertility, or loyalty. Their lives were stage performances judged at every step. But as the centuries went on, the cruelty evolved into even darker practices. Some queens accused of sexual transgressions were punished with shocking brutality, their intimate lives weaponized against them in ways designed to destroy both their bodies and their legacies. And those punishments are the next horrifying secret we must expose. When queens were accused of sexual betrayal, the punishments went far beyond scandal. They often turned into spectacles of terror. These women were not only wives, but also symbols of dynastic honor. Any suspicion of infidelity, whether true or false, threatened the legitimacy of heirs. And in medieval courts, protecting the dynasty outweighed protecting the queen's life. One of the most infamous cases was that of Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII of England. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, she was paraded as a traitor before being executed by sword. Historians still debate whether she was guilty or framed, but what remains certain is how her sexuality was weaponized against her. Her alleged lovers were tortured and killed, while Anne's body became the ultimate proof of royal power, silenced and destroyed. But Anne was not alone. In France, Marguerite de Bourgogne, wife of King Louis X, was accused of adultery during the notorious Tour de Nesle affair. Locked away in prison, she died young, disgraced, and erased from memory. Her supposed lovers were executed with brutal public displays meant to warn others of the price of touching a queen. Sometimes the punishments were not death, but lifelong humiliation. Accused queens were forced into convents, stripped of titles, and made to live under watch until their deaths. These punishments sent a clear message. The queen's body did not belong to her. It belonged to the crown. What made these trials even more disturbing was the lack of evidence. A jealous courtier, a political rival, or even a king who wanted to replace his wife could spread rumors, and that alone could seal her fate. Sexual betrayal was the most dangerous accusation because it was almost impossible to disprove. Public punishment played a crucial role. Executions were often staged in front of crowds, turning the queen's downfall into a form of theater. The very people who once celebrated her coronation now gathered to watch her destruction. And when her body was displayed or buried without honor, it sent a chilling reminder. No queen was untouchable. Yet behind this cruelty lay fear. Kings feared losing control of their lineages, feared illegitimate heirs, and feared their queens gaining too much independence. By making examples of accused women, they tightened their grip over every queen who came after. But there was another, even darker layer. Some queens were not only punished for betrayal, but also forced into systems of sexual servitude, where their bodies became tools of alliances, hostages, and political games. That's the next hidden truth we must uncover. Queens were not always wives by choice. Many were political hostages, married off as part of treaties, exchanges, and fragile peace agreements. Their marriages were less about love and more about control. And once they entered foreign courts, their sexuality became a weapon, one they often could not wield for themselves. Take Isabella of France, known as the She-Wolf of France. Sent to England as a young bride to King Edward II, she quickly discovered her role was not that of a wife, but of a political pawn. Edward was openly devoted to his male favorites, leaving Isabella humiliated. She used her body strategically, later aligning with her lover Roger Mortimer to overthrow her husband. What began as exploitation turned into rebellion, but her reputation was forever stained by accusations of immorality. Other queens were forced into public demonstrations of fertility, their pregnancies scrutinized as proof of alliances. If a queen failed to conceive, whispers of infertility or secret affairs followed her everywhere. Kara's ability to produce heirs was seen not as a personal matter, but as a matter of state survival. In some courts, queens were treated as sexual trophies, flaunted to demonstrate dominance. When an enemy was defeated, his wife or daughter could be seized and paraded as the spoils of victory. These women were expected to submit, bearing children that bound their bloodlines to those of conquerors. A queen could wake up one day as a ruler's partner, and the next as a prisoner in her own palace. Worse still, the threat of sexual humiliation was often used as diplomatic blackmail. If a queen resisted, enemies threatened to spread rumors of her infidelity or stage fabricated scandals. Entire wars could ignite from such accusations as rival dynasties claimed a queen's children were illegitimate. Behind the jewels and crowns, many queens lived in a silent cage. Their beauty, charm, and fertility were not their own possessions. They were currency in the deadly markets of medieval politics. But while many queens were trapped, a few learned to manipulate this system, turning their forced sexuality into power. These women used seduction, rumor, and secret networks to influence kingdoms from the shadows. And some became infamous for how far they went. Not every queen was a victim. Some learned to play the game of power with dangerous mastery, using their sexuality not only for survival, but for domination. Their scandals became whispered legends that reshaped kingdoms. One notorious example is Catherine the Great of Russia, whose name is still tangled with wild sexual rumors centuries later. Though most of these tales were exaggerated or invented by her enemies, they reveal how easily a queen's private life could be turned into political propaganda. Catherine took lovers openly, carefully selecting powerful men who could secure her throne. In the eyes of rivals, this was seen as shocking immorality. In reality, it was a calculated system of power. Another infamous figure was Joanna of Naples, accused of poisoning her husbands and taking lovers at will. Her enemies painted her as a lustful demon queen, to justify attempts to overthrow her. Whether the charges were true or fabricated, the damage was done. Her reign became forever tied to scandal. Then there was Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval world. She was rumored to have engaged in affairs during the Crusades and was even accused of seducing her uncle. Though historians doubt these claims, they show how dangerous it was for a queen to be strong and independent. The easiest way to destroy her image was to attack her sexuality. In many ways, these queens weaponized the very tool used against them. If they were already viewed as temptresses, they leaned into the role, bending men to their will. They made courts tremble, treaties collapse, and kings rage in jealousy. But playing with scandal was like dancing on the edge of a blade. A single rumor could crown a queen with fearsome power, but the same rumor could also destroy her legacy. Even centuries later, the sexual stories of these queens overshadowed their political achievements. Their lives force us to ask, were these women truly immoral, or were they victims of a double standard, condemned for the very same actions their male counterparts celebrated? As we move toward the end of this dark history, we find that some queens didn't just live with scandal. They embraced it to build empires. But their legacies remain split between admiration and disgust. When we look back at the medieval world, the sexual practices of queens appear like shadows behind gilded thrones. Some of these women were forced into degrading roles, their bodies turned into tools of diplomacy. Others chose to embrace sexuality as a weapon, carving out influence in courts where they otherwise would have been powerless. Yet in every case, the legacy they left behind was shaped less by truth and more by rumor, scandal, and fear. Chroniclers, nearly always men, wrote their stories through the lens of morality and control. A queen's love affair was not simply personal. It became political ammunition. Enemies turned her bedroom into a battlefield, and her reputation into a casualty. What remains most shocking is not just what queens did in private, but how their private lives were used against them. A king's mistresses could be overlooked, even celebrated. But a queen who took a lover was called dangerous, corrupt, even demonic. This double standard cemented itself in the chronicles of history, turning women into cautionary tales. Some names remain forever tied to whispers of forbidden sexuality. Catherine the Great, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Isabella of France. Whether their reputations were earned or fabricated, their legacies remind us of the fragile line between power and disgrace. For medieval queens, sexuality was never private. It was a stage upon which kingdoms rose or fell. And perhaps the darkest truth is this: these queens never truly escaped their stories. Even today, centuries later, their sexual reputations remain more famous than their political victories. What should have been tales of wisdom, bravery, or leadership have been overshadowed by gossip. In the end, the most shocking sexual practices of medieval queens were not just what happened in their chambers, but how those stories were twisted, magnified, and weaponized to control how history remembered them. That is the dark legacy they left behind, one where desire, rumor, and power remain forever entangled.